Welcome to My Therapist Says, an interactive experience enriching your most important relationships. During today's event, I'll be your host and moderator as we present Freedom from the Chains of Addictive Behavior. As we focus on today's topic, I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Conzen, a licensed marriage and family therapist, professor, author, and certified chemical dependence counselor. Dr. Conzen earned her MA in marital and family therapy and PsyD in marriage and family therapy from Alliant International University in San Diego, California. She's been a regular guest on our broadcast. Today's event takes place before a live audience, live streaming, and questions shared from the audience and those listening to this broadcast. While offering practical, biblical, and scientific solutions, it's like having your own Christian relationship doctor within the comforts of your living room. I hope you will sit back, relax, and take in these life-changing insights. Please join me as we connect with a live audience in My Therapist Says. Well, Dr. Jennifer Conzen, we welcome you this evening, and would you all join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Conzen?
And we're jumping right in.
We are
Hello.
jumping right in.
It is really lovely to be with you all. When Dawn asked me, when we actually talked about meeting, we talked about the importance of this topic, and like Dawn said, I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified sex therapist, and I'm also a certified chemical dependency counselor. So a lot of what I do is covered by things that go wrong with our bodies. So, because I'm also work with eating disorders, so they all kind of overlap, the body, sex, and drugs. So we're going to go over a lot of that. And is this going to be on at all? Just
I think the monitor's going to be on. Am I correct?
Monitor's going to be on. So I am the author of a book that's coming out. It's called The Ransomed Journey. So we kind of have a double name of this presentation tonight. That book will be out in June. And it really is important, just even the title, The Ransomed Journey, that often the process of recovery from addiction is a bit of a journey. And that God, Jesus, we are ransomed by his blood. So it is a ransomed journey. We are brought into a new life because of his sacrifice of his son. Now, what we do know is that in the midst of really dealing with substances of addiction and behaviors of addiction, it's really important that we found our understanding of addiction in the overall understanding of how God made us. He made our bodies, and he made us to enjoy life. He made things for us to enjoy. That's really important as we look at addiction. Sensuality, the idea of enjoying our senses and enjoying things, is actually biblical. And this is vital because pleasure is actually God's idea. Look at this. I love this. 1 Timothy 6 says, "Set your hopes on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy." God wants us to enjoy our lives. The thing is, though, Satan is the one that doesn't want us to, so he takes what God makes. The body is good, our senses are good, enjoying things is good. He takes it and he twists it just enough, because that's his job, is to deceive, to lie. John 8, when he lies, he speaks his native language, for he's a liar and the father of lies. So what do we know from the scriptures about addiction? Well, okay, so wine, biblically, is not evil in and of itself. Most of the substances and even the behaviors that would be considered a possible addiction are in and of themselves not evil or bad, but they become problematic when. And so let's look at Titus 2. Teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be addicted to too much wine. I get asked all the time, does the Bible teach about addiction? That word addiction is our lingo in the English language, but the word here is daulu, which means to be enslaved by. In other words, something it owns you. You belong to it, and then what the results are of that enslavement. That's actually what the word in the Greek means, that we now interpret in the NIV as addicted. So what does it say in the scriptures that reflect that? Here's one about wine. Do not gaze at wine when it's red, when it sparkles in the cup. When it goes down smoothly. Oh, goodness, it tastes really good. So almost all addictions feel really good. In the end, it bites like a snake and poisons like a viper. And really, all of the addictions in and of themselves. So Satan takes that, right, that good thing, and twists it. How does it get there? How do we go from enjoyment of a substance to an enslavement to that substance? It's lovely because the Bible actually tells us how. 2 Thessalonians says, "They refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion so that they believe the lie." So the not loving the truth leads to believing the lie. And then he says in Romans 1, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. They didn't think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. The word here in the Greek is gnosko. So God gave them over to a depraved mind, and they end up doing all kinds of things that are not in his plan. So the lack of knowing God is what takes someone from enjoyment to enslavement. And on the flip side, it is our knowing of God that can guide and guard and direct our sensuality. In other words, this word to know is not like a head knowledge. In John 10, it actually says I know the Father and the Father knows me. I know the sheep and the sheep know my voice. The word gnosko means a deep, intimate knowing. And he says that this deep, intimate knowing of God is what will guide us so that we can enjoy something and not be enslaved by it. What we're going to do, so here we've looked at some biblical background. I want to show you what we understand in the world of therapy around addiction. I'm going to look at some definitions. We're going to look at what addiction is by definition, types and kinds of addictions. We're going to look at how we diagnose for it in the field, what would be considered too much, like we're going to look at some facts about specific to substances, and then what does recovery look like? So when it comes to addiction, I love this. He says, drugs. I've never seen the point of them myself. So he's like, I don't do cocaine and meth, but what is he doing? He's actually imbibing two of the most legal and strong of addictive substances, nicotine and alcohol. The most predominant substances of addiction are the legal ones: alcohol, nicotine, and caffeine. So caffeine is actually in the DSM as a proposed diagnosis because caffeine is very addicting. So is nicotine. So the most problematic substances are actually the legal ones. So what are addictions? There are a couple different kinds. There's drug and alcohol addictions in the DSM. So this has to do with the diagnostic manual, drug and alcohol addictions, and then there's behavioral addictions. So that has to do with things that people do that are addictive behaviors. Those can be like gambling, shopping, eating food. Internet gaming is actually in the proposed section of the DSM-5. And then sex addiction. However, the only one of all of those behavioral addictions that's in the DSM is gambling, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. This is what the DSM-5 defines as addiction. These are the processes that happen. It's when someone takes a substance in larger and larger amounts or does a behavior in longer and longer amounts of time than they intend to. When they continue to try to cut down and try to stop and control the level of use, and they keep going back to it. When they spend more and more time either obtaining it, using it, or recovering from it. Again, this is substances and behaviors. And then there's this process of craving, wanting, and that the use of that substance, that behavior, will result in a failure of major role obligations in life. So the other pieces that the DSM also talks about is that there's this continued use even though there are social and interpersonal problems. So in other words, somebody starts giving up the really important things in their life to go do that thing or to go take in that substance. Or they end up not having the kind of relationships that they want to have because of the impact of that substance. And there's a recurrent use even though there are physical hazards. In other words, someone is in danger physically, or their health is in danger physically, or they put someone else in danger physically, but they keep on using. The other two pieces that are actually from the DSM-4, and they're somewhat in the DSM-5, is tolerance and withdrawal, which means the using more and more, and then when you're not using, you feel this agitation like I need to use. So these are the definitions according to the DSM. And there are 10 different substances in the DSM that are in that category, and there are some common things to all of them. And one is that there is including gambling, by the way, an intense activation of the reward system. We call it the dopamine reward system. It's a circular system in the brain where the dopamine, when you take that substance or do that behavior, the dopamine says, woo, this is great, and that desire for that sensation of this is great drives the next use. They call it the dopamine reward system. It occurs with substances, but actually it also occurs with behavioral addictions. They know this actually from studying rats and mice, that same reward system happens with the use of gambling. And there's a concern about the level to which someone is either predisposed or might have a genetic predisposition in all of these, including the gambling addiction, which is in the DSM. Sex addiction, exercise addictions, shopping addiction, food, even internet gaming, all of those were not included because they didn't feel like they had enough research. However, sex addiction is considered by the field as a legitimate addiction. When it comes to the substances, look at this. All these little pieces of the pie are all the other drugs. This little big old tan area is alcohol. Alcohol is, look at it, it's half of the issue when it comes to addiction. So we can say, oh my gosh, meth, San Diego has been the meth capital twice. We've got the hydrocodone problems. Alcohol's the biggest issue. Of the illicit drugs, which I'm including marijuana in that because it is in many of our states, marijuana is the number one use for addiction. People say marijuana's not addictive. That's actually not correct. It has addictive. It just isn't addictive in the same way that some of the other drugs are. So let's go on from there. And this is just us in California. I actually took this picture. If you're driving north on the freeway out of California, welcome to Weed, California, right? It's actually a real place. It says, I laughed, next 3 exits. So let me give you a little bit of education, a little bit more about what addiction looks like. So we're going to move through these relatively quickly. So it's taking the substance, and here we're looking at coffee, in larger amounts over a longer period than intended. So this cup is getting larger and larger. Got to drink more coffee, right? And there's a craving. Got to have it, got to have it. I'm going to make my grocery list. I'm going to put coffee on it, and then I'm going to put coffee on it again, and I'm going to try not to scream at anybody this time. And I should get coffee on the way there, and I'll put bread on the list too. So this desire more and more and more for the substance. And, I keep trying to stop, but I'm having a hard time. This persistent desire to cut down, but it keeps on controlling me. And then there's the long lines. It takes a lot of time to get this substance. This is the long line around a Starbucks. A great deal of time spent trying to obtain and recover from the effects. And it might affect your relationships. Sometimes you meet people who change for the better. These people are called baristas. So you end up with new relationships because, caffeine is now your source of strength. And that you're continuing to use even though it's causing you problems. When you drink coffee, you do stupid things faster, but with more energy. So you continue using even though it's creating all kinds of challenges, and you really do it in physically hazardous situations. Yeah, there you go. And that not only that, but you're needing more and more. In fact, now you're hooking yourself up to the caffeine IV in order to get more. And oh my goodness, it causes all kinds of personality and psychological changes. So all tongue-in-cheek, that's just a really quick way and goofy way of explaining how we define addiction. Okay. Now, what does it mean as far as substances, the amount that you put in? Remember that big old thing of coffee? What does that mean about alcohol? So they base the amount, and I just want to do some quick education on this because it's so important. How much you take in affects your blood alcohol level. What is one drink? So one drink is a 12-ounce beer, which is at about a 5% alcohol, or a 12-ounce glass of a malt liquor, which is equivalent to a 5-ounce glass of wine, which is equivalent to that little teeny 1.5 of a much higher percentage of alcohol in the spirits like whiskey and vodka. So somebody that's going to have a larger amount of whiskey, that's got a lot more potential in it. What does it do to the body? On the left here, you have the healthy liver. In the middle, you have a fatty liver. It's becoming unhealthy. And then you have cirrhosis. I actually have a family member who has an outgrowth in the stomach area. It's actually, they have cirrhosis, and it's protruding from the stomach. And it does lead to and can lead to death. So cirrhosis, so any substance can become, I'm just giving you a picture of, say, alcohol and the problems it can cause, not only in addiction, but also to the body. It's important. I use this when I'm teaching my young audiences. What is considered unsafe driving? Actually, our new information is any drinking causes unsafe driving. One drink actually already impairs your skills, just one. It slows down your ability to hit the brake on time, and so on. 2 drinks. Actually, can you go back to that one? So 2 drinks. Look under the number 2, follow the F, which means female, all the way to 160 pounds. See how it says 0.08? So a female who weighs 160 pounds, when she takes 1 drink in an hour, she is at 0.08. A male is at 0.07 because he has a larger muscular mass. Why is that important? We tend to think, well, I just had 2 and then I went driving. Let me show you the next graph. This is really important. 1 drink, when you take it in an hour, by the second hour, so an hour later, you're underneath the legal limit. But if you have 2 drinks, it takes you until hour 5 to be under the legal limit. So that's just important to know, because people ask me that all the time. How many can you have? Well, 2 in a 5-hour period. So if you're ever wondering how much is too much. So drugs of addiction cover all of these. They cover the hallucinogens, the opiates, marijuana in all of its forms. Adderall and Ritalin are used as drugs of addiction. Meth is, again, San Diego has been the meth capital a couple different times. Ecstasy is very popular on the party scene right now, and cocaine in all of its forms. Opiates, they have farming parties where they just go into grandma and grandpa's cabinets, take all of the drugs, put them in a bowl, and you take a handful and toss them in. So that's called a farming party. Behavioral addictions are the food addictions, gambling addiction, and sex addiction. I'm showing you these because I just love the give me chocolate and nobody gets hurt. So the thing about all of them, though, is that often they started out legal. If you look at heroin, look at this. In 1805, morphine is purified. 1853, they create the hypodermic needle. 1898, Bayer invents heroin. Did you know that? 1913, Bayer says, oh, we're having a problem, so they stop production. 1916, oxycodone is synthesized. And then in 1995, the FDA approves it. And guess what happens in 20 years? We are at a crisis. In 2018 and 2019, we now have 2 different big bills that have come through Congress saying we're having a problem here. So something starts off as, this helps people, and then it ends up problematic. All substances can become problematic. You can actually drink too much water. Did you know that? So what about the behavior? I want to go a little bit into sexual addiction here. It's very similar if you look at the definition. This is not in the DSM, but it is in the field of addiction care. The lack of control of cybersexual pursuits despite adverse consequences. There's a sense of well-being and euphoria when someone goes online and masturbates to pornography or gets involved in cybersex. There's a feeling of being unable and unwilling to stop. I'm trying, and I keep going back to it, doing it more and more, and doing more, and like increasing the type of things that they're looking at and doing. Neglecting relationships, so they begin neglecting their other intimate relationships, or they stop doing other fun things with other people, literally to get involved in the pornography. Feelings of emptiness, in other words, that kind of, I'm needing it more, that's the craving there. Lying to cover up the use. Rituals of performance, that would mean somebody that sets up their computer station. I ask this when I'm asking somebody about their addictive processes. I ask them if they're involved in, I use the same cloth, I sit in the same place, I click on the same button. And then the biggest thing that happens with sexual addiction is the flashing of the pictures. The challenges with our memories is those pictures stay in the brain, and they keep flashing into the brain over and over, honestly, for decades. So that's one of the challenges, is that those intrusive and inappropriate, and it causes anxiety and distress. So the behavior outlets for sexual addiction are masturbation, pornography, yes, engaging in sexual behavior with consenting adults. In other words, somebody that's going out and engaging with prostitutes and so on, and then telephone sex, or what would now be online cyber sex more often, and then going to adult entertainment venues. So all of those would be included in checking on the diagnoses. We tend to think this is a male thing. It is not. Yes, the numbers are about 80 to 90% of males have engaged in pornography, definitely in their lifetime, and then the percentage that have done it in the last month is about half that, but the percentage of men is about 90%. It used to be like about 30% for women. It's now getting to about 50 to 60%. The internet has made pornography so available that we tend to think, oh, we need to have purity groups for men. Actually, we need to have purity groups for women as well. James 1, though, helps us focus on something really important. It says that by his own evil desires, a man is dragged away and enticed, and this gives birth to sin, which gives birth to death. And we tend to pay attention to the sin and the death, but we forget to pay attention to the dragged away and enticed. That enticement is the pull. Why somebody is pursuing whatever that thing is that they're addicted to. That is one of the most important pieces to do when someone's going through the process of recovery. So what are some of the common factors in all of these addictions? We do believe there's some genetic factors like medical, biological, and brain approaches to all of the treatments. There's cultural factors involved in all of them. Most of them have some kind of learning behaviors where they're doing habitual habits that are involved, and that there are often the reasons why somebody is pursuing that addiction is out of stress. They're doing it. People will use, I had a mom call me, my son is masturbating 4 times a day, he's 10, what do I do? I think he's got a sexual addiction. And I said, actually, I would consider the fact that he might actually have a problem with anxiety, and he's using masturbation to deal with his anxiety. Often people use any kind of addiction to deal with anxiety. They use it for emotional regulation. Or if someone has a trauma background, they'll go to alcohol to numb the trauma, to numb the memories. And what's common to all of them is that family of origin challenges are also involved. So when it comes to the process of recovery, I'm just going to briefly glance on this because that's a whole talk in and of itself. Don, if you want me to come back. Recovery, one of the biggest things that people don't have, they'll come in my office and they'll say, I have tried everything. Jennifer, I have tried everything. I've been trying to not do pornography anymore. I've been trying not to do the shopping addiction anymore. I've been trying to cut down on my alcohol use, and I just keep coming back to it. I've tried everything. That phrase is pretty common, but actually most of the time people don't have a plan. They don't have a plan for when those pulls happen, like James 1 says, that when I feel stressed, what's my plan? When I've had an argument with my spouse, what's my plan? When I've been turned down for that job or I lost that job, when I am under that kind of fear, what's my plan? So people often don't have a specific plan for what to do when they're triggered. There are a lot of different programs, and so getting people involved in programs, they'll say, I can do it on my own, I can just read some stuff on the internet, but actually group involvement is vital to the process of really good recovery. So there are 12-step programs, there's a program called Smart Recovery, there's a program here in San Diego called Broken Chains, there's a program out of Denver that's now making its way around the world called In Motion. So there's, yes, many different types of programs. You have to have somebody to support you through that. In the anonymous programs, they call them sponsors. Highly recommend that. And then not just support groups for a group, but also going to individual therapy, family therapy, and couples therapy. This would be considered a really good recovery plan. And so that process includes identifying your triggers, that's the James 1 piece, digging in and finding out why are you using, dealing with those underlying issues. And this is vital. You have to have a plan ahead of time for when you relapse, because you're probably going to. Good recovery includes figuring out how to respond to a relapse or a lapse, whatever word you want to use, so you don't spin and end up full-blown going back to full use. Early recovery is considered the dangerous time of relapse, which is 1 to 3 years. Early recovery is 1 to 3 years. And the relapse rates are high, especially at the 1-year mark. Middle recovery is 3 to 5. Somebody is not considered solidly recovered until 5 years plus. So when someone says, hey, I've got 6 months, rejoice with them. But they're still in crisis. And they're going to be in early recovery until year 3. So I want to just give you a little bit of input. If you've got family members, maybe you're not the one dealing with addiction, you're wondering, how do I respond? We do need to learn to speak the truth in love, Ephesians 4:15. Yes, you do need to be truthful and honest. If you are doing enabling behaviors, if you're doing things that are actually creating more of a reason for that person to continue, and then how do you figure out when to say enough's enough and to stop helping them? And they need to just be on their own for a bit. That's a big question out there. It's an important question. Also, make sure you're dealing with the right problem. Are they going to the addiction for depression? So then maybe they also need care for depression. Do you need to have, as the family member, proper boundaries, consequences, and expectations? What would be loving discipline where you say, I love you, but you cannot live in this home anymore? In 2 Corinthians 5, I love this scripture. He says, we are to be messengers of reconciliation. You can do all of these things where you have loving discipline and consequences, but you can be God's tool for reconciliation. And then one last piece is, what do I do with couples? This is my book that's coming out called The Ransom Journey in May. One of the biggest things I'm dealing with couples is helping them decide what kind of boundaries they need to have around addiction. I just mentioned that. What would be a therapeutic separation? In other words, we might need to separate from having sex, separate from being in the same bed, separate rooms, or separate homes. I help people with figuring out how to make that decision. What would be solid individual recovery, which is necessary for couples recovery. And then a couple's recovery would be, as a couple, how are they planning for triggers? How are they planning for relapses? How are they communicating about recovery? How are they both learning to have healing conversations? How are they both learning about how their background is influencing the process of use and recovery? And then, can they go to meetings together? Because there's couples meetings to go to in most of the fields. There's couple retreats to go through, and then going to couples therapy. And then finally, how do you return to intimacy after addiction? So, why should you do that? Most of the field for addiction says, do individual recovery, but research doesn't support that. Research actually supports that couples recovery helps the individual in their recovery, when it's done well. So, why should we do it? That's why. Research actually supports it. So here's my book. It's coming out. I hope you read it. I like it. That picture is actually, a friend of mine took that picture. I love it. How to get to that place somewhere of peace, relaxation, and spiritual recovery in the midst of the journey is the goal. So, there we go. A few minutes over.
All right. Join me in thanking Dr. Jennifer Condon for her presentation, if you would, please. Thank you.
Can you go back and just put the other book up there just as we're answering questions? Thank you. So, yeah.
Very good. We do have a hand up, so we have some cards. If the host could come by and pick those up. I do have some questions here as we begin our discussion now. If you do not have a 3x5 card, just raise your hand without the card, and we'll bring you a 3x5 card. If you do have a 3x5 card and you have a question, just raise it in the air as this person at the front has done so. We have 2 up front, 3 up front. If someone can, or one of our hosts come by and help us with that, that would be helpful as we begin our discussion here. One of the first questions that has been raised, and that is, can you tell about the differences between bad habits, obsessions, and addictions? So we're going to talk just a moment about, can you talk about the differences between bad habits, obsessions, and addictions?
Well, the reality is we all have bad habits. There's actually a book called, now I can't remember the title, but it talks about chocolate. Chocolate's a theme tonight for me. actually everything, including something as lovely as chocolate, we can get into habits that maybe aren't the best, but we start repeating them. So habits would be, it may not be causing problems at your job, it may not be causing problems in your marriage, but you're not really happy with it. It might be causing some health problems. So that would be the lower end. An obsession has to do with, I can't stop thinking about it. All of those obsessions and habits are involved in addiction. So that's kind of like a coming to. Addiction, they say, is it just that people are reaching for that addiction because they're having problems with managing their emotions? Yes, but actually sometimes people enter addiction through habitual behaviors where they just get used to standing at a party. I had a young woman, she was 30, and she said she was so used to standing in a party with the beer in her hand that that's what she just had to do when she was at a party. So the habit then becomes, she started drinking more and more and started drinking to blackout. So it'll start with a habitual piece that kind of crosses over into an emotional piece as well. Where obsessions come in really has to do with, sometimes it can cross over into different mental health issues. So OCD can get involved. However, obsessions would be what happens when someone's at a higher end of use. In the DSM-5, the way it does addiction is it starts with mild, and then it goes to severe. And obsessions would come in as you're on the higher end of the scale of addiction. They changed addiction. The DSM-4 said you either had substance use or substance abuse. They changed that. The whole thing is called use now, from mild, moderate to severe. And so obsessions would be a growing thing in the process of addiction, that I start to think about it. Now I'm thinking about it more and more. Now I think about it all the time.
So that's number 3 of what you talked about, kind of dealing with the underlying issue. The idea of obsessions is the underlying issues that may be there. You may have a habit.
There might be a habit.
But somehow that may even push you into an obsessive. You were talking about obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, a moment ago.
And so that might be where someone, yes, they need help with the addiction, but they might need help with OCD, or they might need help with depression, or they might need help with anxiety. So looking at the underlying issues are often emotional, using the addictive substance or behavior to deal with and manage emotion.
Okay, so this is back to regulating emotion and how a habit can also be regulating emotion.
It can.
Yes.
So addictive use can start just by habit. So somebody just keeps doing something over and over,
Give us
and the
an
brain
example of
gets
that.
used to it. So this would be somebody that goes into exercise, and then they go and exercise some more, and they go and exercise some more. It's a good habit initially. Exercising is good, right? But then when that exercise starts to become, I'm thinking about it a lot, I'm obsessed with it, I'm doing it more and more. So now we're going from healthy habit to obsession to where I cannot live life without going and exercising for 3, 4, 5 hours a day.
So how can we learn how to manage that? Say someone, it could be exercise, let's use like exercise. How does a person determine that now I'm moving into more obsession? And it's not just a habit, a good habit perhaps. It's called, for psychodynamic theory, we'd call it sublimation, where we're doing something that seems to be the right thing for perhaps the wrong or non-healthy purposes.
Yeah. So actually the diagnoses for addiction will tell you that. It literally, if it's causing problems with your relationship, when I do an assessment for addiction, one of the prominent questions in it is anybody who loves you and cares about you in your life concerned with your use of this? So if it's affecting your relationships, that's the first place it's going to show up. If you find that you're doing that thing, whatever it is, and you're saying to your friends, something you would normally have liked to have done, but you start finding that you're canceling doing this in order to do that. If it starts to cause problems, so people are missing work, they're missing work because they either were hung over or they were at work and caught doing pornography on their work computer. So they are now knowing they're using it even though they might lose their job. So when it starts causing problems with work, with health, with relationships, that's when you're actually along the farther end of the spectrum. I think, though, the earlier part of the spectrum would be when it's on your mind a lot. And you you find yourself thinking about, so this is with gambling, it's called, chasing, where you're thinking and planning when's the next way and how are you going to play that poker hand. So you're thinking and planning about it, and you're almost daydreaming about it. You find it on your mind a lot more. What site are you going to go to? What game are you going to play? What store are you going to stop by to buy such and such? So when you find yourself thinking about it, that would be kind of the earlier stages that are leading into a higher level of obsession. So.
Okay. This next question moves in a little different direction, and it relates to how long does it take for memory to return after a 20-year daily meth use addiction? That's a really tough question. I do not know the answer to that. But biologically, so how long does it take for memory to return after a 20-year daily meth use?
Yeah. So the drugs of abuse, including alcohol and including meth, do affect the brain systems. And I don't know the specific answer to meth in particular. However, we do know that stopping use, the brain is pretty amazing. It can, it does have some plasticity. The brain can get to a certain point where it can't bounce back. So let me actually review that with alcohol because I'm a little more familiar with that. There was a gentleman, he'd been drinking 5, 6 a day for 20 years, and he's a tennis player and starts noticing that he's having a hard time playing tennis and that he's feeling a slight funny thing happen in his leg. He goes in for neurological testing. His brain has been heavily affected, and that is permanent damage. Now, if he stops drinking, now he might find his thinking gets clearer, his body gets somewhat better, and his liver might get better. So all of the drugs of use meth is really, really damaging to the body. I mean, you look at pictures of long-term meth use, it's very, very damaging. Well, that's just the outward sign of what's happening internally because the brain is very affected by meth and by all of them. So memory, the problem with memory is that when damage is done to the tissues of the brain, memory can be to some level, have some level of permanent damage, but they do find, especially with alcohol, so again, this is me speaking about meth as if I knew it, they do find with some of the substances that when someone stops and goes into solid recovery, a lot of capabilities will return. Memory is a tough one. It does affect things for a long time. So it kind of depends on the drug and how much they took. So once a day versus all day, it depends on the amount.
Okay, that's a really tough
question
because we would have to pull out research to define that particular
memory is
question.
Affected.
Yeah, you think of even when you think of not cocaine, excuse me, when you think of cannabis and the treachery that is upon memory
cannabis
itself.
Really affects things.
Yes.
We think, it's not addictive. No, cannabis really affects things.
Yeah,
long term.
Let's talk
especially long-term heavy use.
Yeah, long-term heavy use. You have the constriction, so you have the blood flow that is actually decreased significantly.
It's a demotivator. Cannabis is a demotivator. So literally, it's a depressant.
Yes.
So I was working with a young woman who was smoking regularly every day, and she had no motivation to go to work, to go to school, lost several jobs, and I just saw her for one session and said, actually, that's partially because cannabis is a demotivator.
Yes.
She came and saw me a year later, and she had stopped smoking. And I said, why? She goes, I just kept thinking about how you said it was a demotivator.
Yeah.
And I thought, I don't want to take something in that makes me not want to live life. And she had seen a huge difference. So we often don't realize the depths of the physical impact it has. Like huffing, for instance. So that's a kind of a lesser-known substance abuse. So this is taking a spray can into a bag and breathing in the substance. Huffing it's actually one of the most destructive forms of addictive use, and it is very addicting, the substance that are used in those spray cans. Well, the challenge with huffing is that it's going right into your nasal passages into your brain. So the access points are really damaging. So we do need to pay attention to how our brain is affected.
Yes.
Because it is.
Yes. And this next question relates to really how we may stop in our maturing, decrease our maturing. Does a person stop maturing mentally and emotionally when he or she embarks on a 20-year drug addiction to, say, meth or some other?
Yeah. So it does depend on when. So they do know that if people become addicted to a substance after the age of 19, the years of addiction recovery are like cut in half. Why? Because when those substances are taken in your early years, they delay development. It's kind of like if someone was 10, 12, when a divorce happens in their family, there's going to be some emotional development that gets stalled. That's exactly what happens with drugs. When drugs happen, especially during those formative childhood years, 10, 11, 12, and then they go all the way through this the brain is developing tremendously during those years, all the way up until age 25. So all of that development gets stalled. Can someone come back to that level of development when they stop? They can. So emotion development that got stalled at 10 and 12 can then get worked on when someone's older. And that's true when development gets stalled for any reason.
Yeah, it just is much, much more difficult because developmental theorists would suggest that, say you started, which would be a common thing in our society today, even more so we're seeing it with the legalization of cannabis, is that you have the younger set that are being involved in this, and so you have a 12-year-old who their brain is growing and developing, and they're needing to be attached. At the same time, they're needing to be able to tolerate certain anxiety. And a 12-year-old is facing a lot of anxiety that most adults would be able to handle well at, say, 25 or 26 after the brain is fully developed, as you just said, Dr. Konzen, about age 25. So it has to do with the child not being able to tolerate the anxiety. So it sends
so they
them
don't learn that skill.
So they don't have the delay of gratification. So it really stymies them. I don't want to underestimate the fact that they can move through it later, but it's going to make it very, very difficult in later years.
The way to also compare that to would be, right now we have, kids that are being exposed to pornography. It used to be in the later teens, and now it's at about 8 or 10 years old. And the impact that has on the development of the sexual self-schema, the ability to develop healthy and sexuality is impacted. So whether it's a substance, whether it's a behavior, so it's not just the drug addiction, but it's actually the behavioral addictions as well that slow things down.
Thank you. That's a great question. This next question is, my 11-year-old son has been caught vaping. I am an ex-addict. I'm concerned about my son. How do I talk to him without being a hypocrite? So this is
a good question.
It's a great question for so many. Again, let me repeat it. My 11-year-old son has been caught vaping. I am an ex-addict, and I'm concerned about my son. How do I talk to him without being a hypocrite?
Yeah. When someone has a background in addiction and they have done some good work on figuring out, why did I use? What got me there? It can be a great conversation with a younger child on, now, should family members have rules and boundaries? Again, if you can get them to not get addicted to anything till they're 19, it's a good idea. So yes, putting clear guidelines. So you can actually have really clear, this is not allowed in my home, and that's a good idea. However, that doesn't mean they're not going to sneak and hide and can still end up in an addictive process, because they do. So then you're dealing with, how do I reach the underlying reasons why someone's using, including an 11-year-old. Use for the early years is often affected by, yes, who they're around. And so an adult being able to say, I worry about what people think. I worry about it at work. So not even just why I started doing drugs, but I worry about it at work. And I've had some things I've started that I've looked back on later. So I call these vulnerable, real conversations that parents can have with their kids about what the destruction was to their life, and then they look back and they see how I got there. So people always ask me, how much detail should I share? If a child is already using something destructive, then you're probably past the age of being concerned about what level of detail to share. Because actually the more vulnerable parents are, the better. But there is also age-appropriate sharing. 12, though, 11 coming to 12, you're kind of crossing into the pretty much being able to share details. So healthy boundaries is a good idea, and we shouldn't shy away from that. I think at the same time, we can relate to why someone would use. You don't just have to talk, though, about the use. You can talk about your real life today and how you struggled with certain things at work and it's hard for you to deal with that. And then that's why people would reach out for a drink or a substance. Vaping is of great concern on multiple levels right now. They're making all kinds of regulations around it, and we should be having really open and honest conversations. So the more the merrier. The main thing I say with parenting is don't just have conversations about the tough subjects. How are your other conversations going? Are you spending individual time with your child each week? When they are sleepy? My kids were always so talkative when they were just getting ready to fall asleep. Having great conversations with them as they're getting ready to fall asleep. Do shoulder-to-shoulder activities. So if you want to learn how to talk to them, increase your talking in every area. Increase the depth of your connection with them. We made sure, I have 4 kids, we made sure between my husband and I to spend individual time with each of our kids every week. I'd do 2 one week and he'd do the other, and then we'd swap them so that each of our kids had some time with us every week. If you want to have great conversations about the tough subjects, start having them about daily life. Eat dinner together, eat meals together, so that then when you do need to have a conversation about the tough stuff, it's going to go a lot better.
So the idea is...
a little parenting lesson there, just a little bit.
So the idea of quality versus quantity, the idea is how much time you are allotting. Yeah, it needs to be both, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And spending time. There are a lot of different ways to do that. If you want to even think about creating ways to create discussion, there's the ungame. I know you used a lot with your patients. So do I. You can buy them online for $7. It's just called the UNGAME. That helps you to create dialogue. There's lots of tools out there talking about how to create dialogue. There was a question here related to, years ago, I think it was 1956, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't write it on this question, but it was quite some time ago when alcoholism was considered a disease. And that's when it was named, I believe it was back in around 1956. And the question is
like late 1800s.
Was it late
Yeah.
1800s?
Yeah, that's been
as a
around for-
disease?
Yeah.
Okay, I must have that wrong
Yeah.
then. So if that is so, would you consider that still a disease today?
It is still considered a disease today in some circles. So the approach and the view of alcohol differs by... The view of alcohol and the problems with it differs by the approach to treatment. So certain types of treatment view alcohol as a disease. Others view it as a habitual learned behavior that needs to be replaced with other good, more positive behaviors. So the medical approach, most anonymous models would consider a disease. And then there are other models like a harm reduction model and things like that that would consider it a learned behavior. So it depends on the person you're talking to, how they're going to answer that. The majority of our culture would still use the word disease, actually, because AA is, the anonymous groups are the predominant form of treatment for addiction.
This person asked the question, my brother's been diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver due to alcohol abuse and continues to drink on and off. How can I help him but still have healthy boundaries when he lives with me? So again, the question, my brother was just diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver due to alcohol abuse and continues to drink on and off. How can I help him but still have healthy boundaries when he lives with me? How would you approach that?
Yeah, and that would depend on what his alcohol use looks like. I worked with a couple where his use, and he definitely was having some neuro problems due to his use. He was losing his balance, and he was in his 70s, and they were in a coupled relationship, and she had those very same questions. Because he wasn't violent, he wasn't breaking things, the police weren't being called, that had never happened, she never felt in danger. How to have healthy boundaries around that is challenging because when things become violent and the problem is clearly causing danger to other people, that boundary of you can't live in this home becomes a little clearer. Alcohol's just a little bit harder because it's not like, say, meth and heroin, where the use causes such immediate problems. Alcohol is insidious. It slowly affects the body, it slowly affects the brain, and it slowly affects the lifestyle. I think the main thing I work with people on is, what are your boundaries? What is okay and not okay in your home? So that would be one thing. If somebody with that question came into my office, what are your boundaries? Are you okay with their intoxication? What happens when they're intoxicated? And if you're not, what kind of boundaries do you want to have around that? So that would be the first place I would start. We do know that there are different stages that people go through in their process of if they're going to enter recovery. And so when someone doesn't think it's a problem, which somebody with cirrhosis is going to usually go, obviously I have a problem. Yes. If they're, though, at I don't think it's a problem, it's what you call pre-contemplation stage, where the best thing to do then is give education. That's actually what I did with this gal who said she's smoking marijuana a couple times a day, and she was losing her jobs and stuff like that. So I just dropped a little seed of education about how it causes lower motivation, and she took that and made a decision. So at pre-contemplation, one of the best things you can do is just provide some education. At contemplation is where they go, I think there might be some problems, but they're not ready to act on them, which might be this individual. And at contemplation, what you're doing is you're actually validating the fact that they go back and forth on whether they want to do something about it. You validate the reality that changing the drinking habits means giving up a lot. It means giving up the comfort that you feel from the drink, the relationship that you have with it. There are positives. All use has some positives. That's why people do it. And so it's giving up those positives. Some people are more relaxed and less stressed, they think, under the use of alcohol. So now it means that those emotions are going to be coming up quite a bit more. So validating the fact that they are ambivalent about changing at that level.
You're talking about the pre-contemplative at this point.
No, contemplative.
You're contemplative?
You validate their ambivalence, that they know there's a problem, but they're not sure if they want to do something about it. You go, sure, actually, that makes sense, because, if you were to give up X, Y, and Z, it would mean X, Y, and Z. And so that's so it's not, I'm trying to convince them to change it. Let me just give that one little answer. Start first with validating their ambivalence. That'd be a first step. There's a few more steps after that, but that would be the first one.
Yeah. So
give some education.
And some education.
Yep.
So what would be some language that this person would say that would help to see that they are contemplating this ambivalence? What would be some language you would hear?
So my favorite approach would be what you call a motivational interviewing approach. They call it rolling with the resistance.
Right.
This person is resistant, they don't want to change, and you roll with it. And you say, yeah, so that makes sense, because if you were to stop to drink less, then your day would be more boring, or whatever. Find out. So this would be where you would start with, tell me what it does for you. This is a really important part, so I'm glad you asked. What does it do for them? Find out. If you want to deal with their ambivalence, find out what it's doing for them. It's doing something for them. There's a reason why people get involved in addiction. There is a positive reason. There's something they're getting from it. So find out what that is and go, so that would make sense, that if you gave that up, you might not any longer have that. This happens with couples. I was working with a couple where they were both doing marijuana together, and using marijuana was the only time that she felt, under the influence of marijuana, that she felt comfortable to engage sexually. So giving up marijuana for him was hard, because then all of a sudden she wasn't as comfortable around sexuality. She actually went into rehab. So gave up all substances when she'd been relying on substances to engage sexually. So validating the fact that if you take that thing that they're relying on for whatever they're using it for away, has its challenges. It sounds kind of counterproductive. Why in the world would you do that? But they do know from research that if you, instead of trying to force them to face things, to roll with the resistance, works a lot better. If you want to read more on that, I would recommend any book on motivational interviewing. Great approach.
That's a modality in the mental health
It's a
field.
specific modality.
Yeah, specific modality, how to work
Probably the
with.
most researched one, actually,
Yeah,
for addiction.
yeah. And it has a lot to
Besides
do.
CBT.
Yeah, except for cognitive behavioral
Yeah.
therapy. That's what she's referring to as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which would be the most researched in comparison of the two. But with this, you're going back to dealing with the underlying issue. That you gave 5: specific plan when triggered. Number 2, dig in. Number 3, dealing with underlying issues. Then 4, relapse plan. Number 5, early, middle, and late recovery. But I think I'm hearing you suggest that you're dealing at that point with the underlying issues that may be driving.
So, and sometimes the dealing with the underlying issues comes later. The first chunk of time in early recovery, there is a certain level of grit your teeth and put really strong things into place so that you won't use. This is the really working your program. So the anonymous groups call it a 90-90 or 60-60 or 30-30. Do 30 meetings in 30 days or do 90 meetings in 90 days. So there's a certain level of, I have to get the help that I need, and I need to be drastic about it. So this is the whole, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, so you don't get thrown into the, right? So be drastic that Jesus teaches. So there is a certain level of the early time of recovery that's just, I gotta kind of dig in and do the hard work. Recovery is really hard. Recovery is a hard process. It's a scary process for many. And so they're going to need a lot of support during those early stages, especially if relapses happen. The learning about the underlying stuff comes with time. That's where in an anonymous group, you're going to be doing the 12 steps. In therapy, you might be dealing with the trauma in your background and the emotion expression and identification and management. And so those are vital pieces. Sometimes people are just hanging on by a thread going to meetings to stop use. That would be in the early stages of the first few months. And then the ability to work on the underlying things, the reason why sometimes that gets delayed is because when you bring up all of those emotions, it can be a trigger to drink or to use or to go back to pornography. So that's why you have to actually strengthen the process of support, going to meetings, having a sponsor, because the early trigger to use is very high. And in most recovery programs, so if someone goes into a rehab, most of these young therapists who are working in rehabs, I know because I was the clinical director for a rehab program, and you're training these young therapists who are doing therapy with these individuals who are in the rehab. What they're told is don't get into their traumas. In their first 6 months in the rehab, you are not a trauma therapist. Do not start dealing with their traumas until they're 6 months solid. I don't know if I completely always say should be the case for everybody, but there is some wisdom to that, in that if you get into the traumas too soon, it can be actually a trigger for relapse. So you do want to deal with the underlying issues. You just might have to do it wisely and a little bit later along when they're a little bit more solid in their recovery.
Okay. It's very helpful. And when we were talking about number 3, dealing with underlying issues, I know I moved it just a little bit in this direction back to your original presentation. And then number 4 is the relapse plan think it would be helpful to talk just a
Oh,
little bit about,
gosh.
in other words, you have to anticipate
Yep.
that it's likely there will be a relapse.
Yes.
It's the old falling off the wagon. Many of us
Yeah,
have heard
yeah.
that adage before.
Yeah.
So what are some of the plans? How does a person put a plan into place in preparation?
So I actually use a very specific book. It's called Behavioral Couples Therapy for Alcoholism. And it literally has an action plan. And I literally have people fill it out. And it says, what are your triggers? When are the dangerous situations? So if it's, let's just use alcohol, for instance, you need to know when are your dangerous situations. So that's going to be going to a wedding. It's going to be Thanksgiving and Christmas when the family drinks a lot. It's going to be driving down a certain street. So
Super
what are
Bowl.
the certain situations?
Sunday.
Super Bowl parties. Secondly, what are your triggers? Your triggers might be when you're bored. So what's sexual addiction? It might be when you're bored, late at night, when the spouse is gone. So you have to recognize when are the dangerous situations and when are the triggers. And I just, by the way, just overlapped those two. Triggers can be, I'm bored, my boss gave me a negative review, I just had an argument with my partner, and so I reached to press the button, I reached to grab the glass, whatever the addictive response is. So that's a part of a relapse plan, is you have to recognize what are your dangerous situations and what are your triggers. Not just do you recognize them, but now you have to have a plan for each one. So when I am home alone at night and I am tempted to go online and do pornography, do I have a plan, and have I shared it with my sponsor, my mentor, my accountability partner? And does my partner know my plan? Does my spouse know my plan? Do they have any thoughts to add to it? So that piece of knowing my triggers, knowing my dangerous times, and then what is my plan ahead of time, that is part of the relapse plan. The second part of the relapse plan is, it's called when use happens. So you reach for that glass and you have the drink and you've been sober for a year or 10 years. You have not looked at pornography for 3 months and you click on that button. So use happens. What's your plan? And actually, Farrell, who wrote the manual, he goes, how do you get safe? How do you get help? And how do you act quickly? So he has 3 layers, and I walk people through those 3 steps. How do you get help? So if you're drinking, that means you might need to call an Uber. You need to call your sponsor. And how do you act quickly? You leave the bar. You walk out of the reception for the wedding. So that's acting quickly. So you have to think about that ahead of time so that then when you take that one drink, it doesn't become a full binge. It becomes one drink and you have a plan in your mind ahead of time. Oop, okay, I just did it. What was my plan? I'm calling my sponsor, I'm calling an Uber, I'm calling my spouse. Then you put it into practice so it doesn't spiral. That's a relapse plan. And most people don't have one. They've never thought about it. No one's ever sat down. I literally walk people all the way through. I not only do it for the person, but because I do a lot of couples therapy for addiction, I then walk a partner through theirs. They have an action plan that when they see a sign that they think their partner might be using, what's their plan? Instead of attacking their partner, which can happen, or instead of getting a full-blown panic attack, which would be understandable, what is their plan when their partner seems to get all like they're lying again? And what do they do when they notice behaviors that look like their child, their partner, their brother might be using again? So I actually use family members need to have their own relapse prevention plan. What are they going to do? Who are they going to call? Who are you going to call?
Yeah, right. It's the Ghostbusters. Yeah. So it's the idea of the pre-planning, pre-thinking. Actually,
Ahead of time.
Ahead of time. This question, it's a question as we're preparing to close here in about 8 minutes. Is that the question is, how do I figure out my triggers? I know we've talked about this evening. But how do I discern those triggers? What tells me? What causes me to be aware of those triggers?
A lot of times, honestly, awareness of triggers comes after a relapse. So one of the things about a relapse is it should cause you to actually be able to strengthen your recovery program. So when you use, I had a young man who was dealing with pornography, and he had not had any longer than like a month when he first came and saw me. So we were about, I don't know how long into therapy when he had hit about 6 months, and he did use. So he came in to see me, and we walked through, and I walked him back. So when did it happen? What time was it? Where were you? So I always try to ask, where were you? What was happening around this situation? And then what happened before that? And it was so interesting to watch him. He went, I got an email. I said, what was in the email? He said, it was about my grades. So how did you feel about that email? I was stressed. And then he went, oh my goodness. I turned right to the computer.
Yeah.
And so he realized, oh, I felt anxious. I turned to pornography. So he was able to realize, oh, anxiety is a trigger for me. And so he actually strengthened his recovery plan because he learned from the relapse. Relapses are going to happen, learn from them. So a relapse can teach it. But also, sometimes just looking at a list, you can actually, I did. It's right there. See the website, theransomedjourney.com? On that, there is about probably 8 blogs, and one of them is on relapse triggers and signs. Go read a list and go, oh, yep, and go circle yours, and then make a plan for each one. So you can learn from someone else's writings ahead of time what triggers go, oh, I think that's a trigger. I think that's a trigger. Oh, I know that's a trigger. So sometimes you just might need to go read something and start detailing them and make a plan for each one.
So, for example, a very common one for men with pornographic use and behaviors associated with that will be when their wife, say, leaves the house. This is a very common
so
one.
not having a partner around.
Yeah, and just being aware that being alone in the house can
that
trigger
would actually
that.
be called a dangerous situation. So situations in which it happens.
Yes.
Trigger would be, we just had an argument. They're kind of similar. But when a situation would be, I'm alone in the home, I should have a plan for that. And so the partner should be a part of that plan. So I have couples where she's traveling, and they have a plan on what he's going to do while she's traveling.
Right.
Yep.
So that's again, having conversation
Yep.
with your spouse in that situation. And it's backing up and being aware. I understand you're dividing those two, the trigger and a dangerous situation. They tend to overlap quite well.
Yeah.
And that is being aware of that situation.
When are the circumstances
surrounding
where I may be more likely to use?
Yes.
And so when I'm by myself, I'm more likely to use.
Yes.
But triggers might be emotional triggers. A bad thing happens that day. What's that quick one?
Yeah, so that's almost involuntary reaction is what you're referring to at that point. Just real quickly, with just a few minutes left, I know that Skyline Church has a number of Unleashed Warriors. That's a group here working with pornographic use and other issues related to sexuality. There are many recovery groups here and other churches. That was one of the questions here.
We do need more groups for women.
Yes, we actually have one here for women.
Good, yay.
Yes, and actually, the one we have for women is a recovering husband. And
so that's just it. The groups are for partners that have a partner who's using. We actually need groups for women involved with sexual addiction and with addiction.
Yes. So, as we wind down, anything else you would like to...
Can I answer that question a little bit more?
Yes.
There are groups that are online. So my favorite for sexual addiction is Setting Captives Free. You can actually go online, you can get a mentor, and it takes you through a 60-day or 90-day program. It's very Bible-based, great program. So there are also online groups. There is... So, especially for the young among us, there are many forms of support. I had a woman she was on an online group for her alcohol use, and she found it so incredibly supportive. So, there's a number of choices. But yes, having a community of support, we know that from research, is a huge part of solid recovery.
Yes, and you mentioned it early on in your presentation that for recovery, it's in relationship, not isolation. And there's a tendency with addictions and obsessions to be isolated in the process. Well, thank you, Dr. Konzen. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Jennifer Konzen, our presenter, well-educated and well-versed in this topic. So thank you for attending this evening. I wanted to mention that we actually have a follow-up of this presentation next month, and this will be Tuesday, March 3rd, Maintaining Sobriety from Addictions. And we have Dr. Julie Hayden, who is also a specialist in this area. So again, that's about a month from now, a little less than a month, Maintaining Sobriety from Addictions. So you may want to attend that or watch the presentation live streaming or after the presentation. Let's have a word of prayer as we end this evening. Thank you for coming to and attending To Become One. Father, we thank you for, again, the ability to do this self-regulation and the important topic of addiction that is so important. Thank you for Dr. Conson, who has been with us here this evening with her expertise. And just bless us as we leave this auditorium this evening, that we would be a blessing to those around us and that you would guide us. And we give you praise, thanking you for your presence here this evening. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Once again, thank you for attending. My therapist says good evening to you.